Hi, welcome to Daily Readings with Pastor Nate. Today we're on Matthew chapter 20, so if you haven't done it already, please pause this video and read that chapter in your favorite translation. As always, I'll include the URL for an online version in the description below if you'd like to use that. So please do that now. All right, welcome back. The beginning of this chapter picks up exactly where chapter 19 ended. There's no connecting words here, and then, or later, or as they. It's Jesus talking. He was talking at the end of chapter 19, and he's still talking as we begin chapter 20. If you haven't watched yesterday's video, or if you don't remember, he ends by talking about these rewards in the kingdom. People who have made sacrifices in this world will be rewarded in eternity and will have eternal life. And there's a connection between those two things, obviously, in what Jesus is saying. And then he continues to talk. He ended chapter 19. I mean, it wasn't chapter 19 at the time, but the last thing we read in chapter 19, he was saying how the first will be last and the last will be first. And now he begins with this parable that's kind of expanding on that. And he talks about this guy who owns a vineyard, and he goes out and hires laborers. And first thing in the morning, he hires laborers, and they agree to work the whole day for a day's wages. And then the guy goes out 3 hours later and hires some more people, and goes out another 3 hours after that and hires some more people. And he keeps doing that until the last group of people that he hires is basically at the end of the day. There might be an hour or two left to work. And when that day ends and he comes out to pay everybody, he calls to him first those people who'd only worked for an hour or two, and he pays them a whole day's wage. And they go away, and they're probably pretty excited about that. They got a whole day's wage for only a few hours work. And as he goes down the line earlier and earlier in the day, he keeps giving each of them the same reward. He keeps giving each of them the day's wage. And when he gets to, by the time he gets to the people who have been there the entire day, they're feeling cheated that they only received a day's pay when people who were there for only an hour or two also received a day's pay. And the master says to them, listen, you received the reward that you agreed to. You received the wage that you agreed to. If I want to pay them more than was necessary, what business of that is yours? And then he says, in this way, those who are last will be first, and those who are first will be last. So the idea here basically is that it's up to God to give us whatever reward he wants. If he wants to reward us more than we deserve, then that's up to him. It's not up to us. It's not up to us to chastise him for that or try to call him out or complain about that. It's certainly not up to us to feel hurt or offended or bitter about that. This was maybe even more significant in its original context. Or just thinking about Matthew, a Jewish Christian writing to a primarily Jewish Christian audience. There may have been some sense of resentment among this Jewish community. Like, hey, we have thousands of years of tradition. We're part of God's chosen people and have been for generations. We were the ones entrusted with the law, the ones who have been keeping the law. And now you're going to offer eternal life to these new people. And for so much cheaper, it seems. I mean, it wasn't cheaper. Jesus paid the price one way or the other. But after generations of trying to live up to the law and preserve the law and pass on the law, and some generations were very, very bad at that. And you read these stories in the Old Testament about rediscovering the law, the book of the law, because it had been forgotten. And at times they failed pretty miserably in that task. But they had for generations, for centuries, been charged with maintaining God's presence on earth when they were maintaining the temple and the tabernacle before that and the Ark of the Covenant. And they had been charged with preserving the law and transmitting it and following it. And they had been waiting for this coming Messiah. They've been waiting for this promised one who was going to come and deliver them and set up a throne and a kingdom that would never end and all of these things. And now, as Jesus comes, it's not just them who are receiving. And in fact, the people who had been on the outside all along are being invited in first. And then you have this remnant from Israel that comes later. in some ways that seems like a contradiction, because earlier on we see Jesus saying, well, I'm not here for everybody. I'm here first for the Jews. I'm here for these chosen people. He says that to the Canaanite woman. And there's a recognition now as his ministry unfolds that this is going to go beyond just the Jewish people. And this parable is kind of about how there's more people coming in, and the people who began this thing might not be the first ones to receive the reward. And it also, I think, speaks to us, because sometimes we have this tendency to feel like, well, I've been trying so hard, and I grew up in the church, and I never had this party phase, or I never committed this sin because I was making the sacrifice for Jesus. And then we see somebody else come along who's done everything wrong, and for some reason God touches their life and transforms them. And sometimes there can be a little bit of envy or bitterness that creeps in. God, why would you pick them? God, why would you pour out grace and mercy on them? Why does their religious life seem so much more satisfying after I've been trying so hard this whole time? You can get more on that by reading the parable of the prodigal son. But for the context here, that's kind of what's going on. There's a danger of us feeling like these people who were hired in the morning, and I've been trying so hard for so long, and how come they're getting something before I am? But the answer is the same to us as it was to them. You'll get the reward that you were promised. And if I decide to give that same reward to somebody else who has come to me more recently, that's up to me. There's no reason for you to be angry about my generosity. So that's just something for us to bear in mind as we check ourselves for that. Am I resentful of people who are coming to Christ late in life? And there's more that I could say about that. Being in a relationship with Christ is its own reward. And in that sense, people who come to Christ later are missing out on part of that reward. But that's a tangent to this parable, so I'll leave it at that. Moving on, Jesus begins to head towards Jerusalem. And that was probably anxious time for the disciples. They're aware that there are people in Jerusalem who want to see Jesus done, who want to see his ministry over, who may even want to see him dead. And so there's probably some fear about heading towards Jerusalem. There was probably also some expectation, though. These guys heard Peter say, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, and Jesus tell him that he's correct. And although they're learning about what Jesus is planning on doing, and we'll see that more in just a second, they still don't really understand. And in their minds, I think at least to some extent, they're still expecting Jesus to be or to become this military figure, this earthly king who's going to rule. And as they're heading to Jerusalem, there was probably some anticipation that things were coming to a head. And in the next chapter, in chapter 21, when we get to the triumphant entry, we really see that, where this expectation is boiling over, and not just the disciples, but all of the crowds of people who gather around for that event are looking to Jesus as the Messiah. But in the midst of that, there's this really, it must have been uncomfortable for them, this really unusual juxtaposition where Jesus is telling them, even as they're heading towards Jerusalem, listen, I'm going to die. I'm going to be executed here. And that was probably hard for them to believe, because they had seen his power. They'd experienced his authority. They had heard this confession from Peter that was confirmed by Jesus himself. And like Peter, it must have seemed very challenging for them to hear, I'm going to die. But that's exactly what Jesus was doing. And he's trying to make that clear to them now, so that it's not as shocking and unexpected when it does actually happen. And I'm not sure how much it really sinks in, because when he is arrested and when he is executed, it does seem to be devastating for his disciples. But here we see Jesus speaking plainly about this. We're heading to Jerusalem and to my death and my resurrection. And as usual, the disciples are kind of thick-headed about it. So after he speaks plainly about this, James and John's mother, the mothers of the sons of Zebedee, comes to Jesus and asks for favor. She says, let one of my sons in your kingdom, let one of my sons sit on your left hand and one of my sons sit on your right hand. And Jesus says, do you know what you're asking? Can you drink this cup? And the answer to the first part of the question is no, they don't know what they're asking. No, she doesn't know what she's asking. The second part is, yeah, they can drink of that cup, and they will, because both of those men are going to be persecuted harshly for their faith. I guess John probably, as far as we know, John didn't actually die a martyr's death. They tried to martyr him, and he survived and ended up living out his life in exile. But they both faced incredible persecution for following Jesus. And in that regard, at least, we're drinking from that same cup. Jesus says it's not for me to decide that, only my Father can do that. And then when they go back to the other 10 and the other 10 hear what's happened, those guys are pretty upset. Like, wait, why are you going behind our back and asking Jesus for this position of authority? And Jesus, instead of just putting down the argument, sees it as an opportunity to teach. And so he tells them about power and authority in the kingdom. And he says, this isn't about making yourself great. If you want to be great, make yourself a servant. He's subverting power. He's subverting the cultural expectation of greatness, right? In that culture like ours, if you're great, you have people serving you. But what Jesus is saying is in the kingdom culture, if you're great, you serve others. And he's using himself as the ultimate example of that, right? Here is Jesus, the one who has all power and authority, who from eternity had the glory of the Father, and he laid that aside and stepped down into the earth, took on a fragile body like the ones we wear, experienced hunger and thirst and pain and helplessness, and became a servant to us. That's our example. That's the person we're supposed to follow. We should mimic that humility. And if we want to be great like Jesus is great, we do that not by lifting ourselves up or lording our authority over other people, but using whatever authority we have for the benefit of others and lowering ourselves to serve others. That's how we live the way that Christ did. And that's what he takes advantage of that moment to teach his disciples. And then finally, the last little scene in this chapter, the crowds are following Jesus and they're passing by these two blind men, and the blind men are calling out, "Lord, Son of David." And there's this beautiful irony to that, right? Because these guys are blind, but in some ways they see Jesus better than most other people, right? Most people don't have the recognition that Jesus is the Son of David. Most people don't recognize Jesus as Lord. At least not at this point. And here are these two blind men who recognize who see both of those things about Jesus. And Jesus hears them shout. He says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And I just think that's such a beautiful question for Jesus to ask. He already knows their needs, but he takes the time to listen and to say, "What do you need from me?" And I think that demonstrates Jesus' desire to hear from us, Jesus' desire for us to open up and share about our needs. And if you ever feel like it's not worth praying because God already knows what I need, Jesus could see that they were blind. Jesus knew what they needed. He knew what they were calling out for, but he still says, "What do you want from me?" And he takes the time to listen, so they know that he hears them. And then he answers, and in this case he answers miraculously. He touches them and restores their sight. And it says, and they followed him. And I love that, right? Because that is at the heart of the gospel. I think that is the heart of the gospel, that we follow Jesus. It's not about receiving the thing that we want and then going back to daily life. It's not about experiencing healing and then just looking like everybody else. It's not about saying a prayer that means one day Jesus will come back for us and drag us kicking and screaming into heaven. It's about entering into relationship with him. It's about following him daily in the little parts of our life and in the big parts of our life, and doing our best to walk side by side with him. And Jesus is constantly inviting us into that. And that is the appropriate response when we experience God's work in our life. So go figure out how to follow Jesus today. If this video was a blessing, like it, share it, subscribe. As always, if you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comment section below or on the Facebook group. And I'll see you tomorrow for Matthew chapter 21.